The Ember Hall wasn't just a restaurant. It was a testament to the fact that money could, in fact, buy gravity. Inside its gilded walls, the normal rules of the universe seemed suspended. Voices were lower, laughter was more musical, and time itself seemed to flow like honey, slow and golden. For the patrons, it was a sanctuary from the friction of ordinary life. For Maya Stone, it was a finely balanced tightrope walk, performed 8 hours a night, 5 nights a week, with a tray of precariously balanced crystal in one hand and a mountain of her late father's medical debt in the other. At 23, Maya moved through the opulent space with a grace that belied the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Her world was a second-floor apartment over a laundromat in a less fashionable part of the city, a place that smelled of fabric softener and her own faint despair. It was a world of dog-eared automotive repair manuals, the lingering scent of motor oil that clung to her father's old coveralls in the back of her closet, and a stack of bills that grew with the quiet, cancerous tenacity of a weed. Each perfectly seared scallop she served, each bottle of vintage Cabernet she uncorked, translated into a fractional payment on a debt that felt infinite. She was a ghost in the machine of other people's luxury, her own dreams deferred and gathering dust like the antique tools in her father's toolbox. Tonight, the apex predator in this gilded ecosystem was Chloe Beaumont. At 25, Chloe was the sole heir to the Beaumont global industrial empire, a sprawling behemoth of manufacturing and logistics built by her father's relentless ambition. But Chloe hadn't inherited the grit, only the spoils. She wore her wealth like armor and a weapon, a shimmering blue dress that cost more than Maya's car, and a constellation of diamonds at her throat and wrists that glittered with cold, indifferent fire. She didn't occupy her corner booth so much as conquer it, flanked by 2 fawning acolytes, a blandly handsome real estate broker named Marcus and a willowy art curator named Serena, both of whom laughed a little too loudly at Chloe's pronouncements. Honestly, the nerve of these people, Chloe was saying, her voice a sharp, polished weapon. She flicked a dismissive hand toward a nearby table. Did you see his watch? A Seiko. In the Ember Hall. It's practically a public nuisance. Marcus chuckled dutifully. The velvet rope must have a hole in it tonight, Chloe. Serena, absorbed in capturing the perfect angle of her champagne flute for social media, added, the aesthetic is suffering, that's for sure. Maya approached the table, her professional smile a carefully constructed mask. She had learned to filter out the casual cruelty of her clientele, to become a functional piece of the decor. But tonight, the barbs felt sharper. Perhaps it was the notice from the bank that had arrived that morning, its red ink like a fresh wound. Good evening. May I take your order, or would you care for another cocktail to start? Maya's voice was a practiced melody of polite deference. Chloe didn't look at her. She was staring at a large abstract painting on the far wall, a tempest of reds and blacks. I sealed the Nakashima deal today, she announced to her friends, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Father said it couldn't be done, said Kenji Nakashima was an old-world traditionalist who wouldn't sell to a corporate entity. She took a triumphant sip of her wine. Turns out even traditionalists have a price. He practically wept with gratitude when I signed. A true shark, just like her father. Marcus cooed. Maya's eyes flickered to the painting. It was a recent acquisition by the restaurant, a piece she had researched on her break. She felt an involuntary twitch, a small corrective impulse she fought to suppress. As she refilled Chloe's water glass, Chloe finally deigned to notice her. What are you staring at? She snapped. My apologies, miss, Maya said, her gaze dropping. I was just admiring the art. Chloe smirked. Of course you were. Let me guess, you're an artist between gigs? No, miss, I appreciate craftsmanship. It was a simple truth. Her father had been a master craftsman, a man who could restore a rusted-out 1965 Shelby GT350 to its former glory, with the patience of a saint and the precision of a surgeon. He had taught her to see the soul in things that were built, not just bought. He had taught her to value the hands that made them. The moment should have ended there. But Chloe, buoyed by her victory in the wine, saw an opportunity for sport. Craftsmanship, she scoffed. It's a mess of paint thrown at a canvas. There's no skill in that. It's just chaos. The words were a spark on dry tinder. Maya's carefully constructed mask began to crack. She thought of her father's gnarled, oil-stained hands, the way he could diagnose an engine's ailment by its sound alone, the meticulous care with which he re-stitched leather upholstery. That was skill. That was craftsmanship. Actually, Maya heard herself say, the word escaping before she could stop it. It's a piece by Hiroshi Matsumoto. He's famous for his single-stroke technique. The entire painting is created with one continuous, complex movement of a single massive brush. It's meant to represent the illusion of chaos born from perfect control. A profound silence fell over the table. Marcus and Serena froze, their smiles faltering. Chloe's face, which had been flushed with arrogant pleasure, slowly hardened into a mask of pure fury. She wasn't just annoyed, she was incandescent with rage. The waitress, a non-entity, a part of the furniture, had not only presumed to speak, but had presumed to know something. She had corrected her, in public. Chloe's eyes, a pale, cold gray, narrowed to slits. "Did I ask for an art lecture from the help?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the gaze of the manager, Brian Coleman, from across the room, a palpable wave of panic. "No, miss, my apologies. I overstepped." But it was too late. The damage was done. Chloe's humiliation required a public sacrifice. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You stand there in your cheap polyester uniform judging your betters. Let me teach you a lesson about control." She picked up her glass of full-bodied Merlot. With a movement that was both languid and vicious, she didn't just toss the wine. She flung it, a perfect crimson arc that splashed across the front of Maya's pristine white shirt. A collective gasp shuddered through the dining room. The dark red liquid soaked through the fabric instantly, cold and sticky against her skin. A few drops spattered onto the small, intricately detailed lapel pin she wore on her uniform, a tiny silver replica of a 1957 Porsche 356 Speedster, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. It was the only piece of him she carried with her every day. Maya stood frozen, the shock a physical blow. The world seemed to shrink to the jagged, ugly stain blooming across her chest and the smug, triumphant look on Chloe Beaumont's face. The clatter of silverware ceased. The hum of conversation died. In the ringing silence, Maya looked down at the tiny silver car, a drop of red wine clinging to it like a bead of blood. And then something inside her snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of her life, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of cold, clear fury. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet Chloe's. The practiced deference was gone, burned away. For the first time, Chloe saw not a servant, but a person, and she saw that person's utter contempt. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the silent room with the chilling clarity of a breaking icicle. "This wine," she began, her tone conversational, "is a Chateau Petrus, 2015. A bottle costs around $4,000. It's an investment, an asset. You just used a $4,000 asset to make a point that's worth absolutely nothing." She gently touched the tiny silver pin on her lapel. "This pin," she continued, her voice gaining a resonant strength, "is a replica of a car my father adored. He spent 3 years of his life restoring one. Every nut, every bolt, every stitch of the upholstery he did by hand. He poured his soul into it. He valued it not for its price, but for the integrity of its design and the honesty of the work required to make it whole again. You have a great deal of money, Miss Beaumont, but you don't possess a single thing of any real value." Without waiting for a response, without another glance at the stunned table, Maya turned with a crisp, deliberate motion and walked away. She left behind a dining room paralyzed in shocked silence, a slowly spreading puddle of expensive wine on the Persian rug, and an heiress who, for the first time in her insulated life, had been surgically dismantled by the truth. She didn't see the manager, Brian Coleman, a man whose spine was made of gelatin, rushing to Chloe's table, his face a rictus of apology. She didn't hear Chloe, her voice trembling with rage, demanding her immediate termination. Maya was already in the staff changing room, her hands shaking so violently She could barely unfasten the wine-stained pin. She cradled it in her palm, wiping the red stain away with a desperate, loving tenderness. The tears didn't come. She was too hollow for tears. The firing was swift and brutally impersonal. "We cannot have our staff antagonizing the guests, Maya," Brian said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. "The Beaumonts are legacy patrons." "She assaulted me," Maya said, her voice flat. "You created a scene," he countered, sliding her final paycheck across his desk. It wasn't even enough to cover the interest payment on one of her father's hospital bills. It was a dismissal sealed with an insult. The bus ride home was a blur. The city lights smeared across the Rain Street window, each one a tiny, indifferent star in a galaxy of other people's lives. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, the scent of bleach and loneliness greeting her at the door. She looked at the stack of bills on her small kitchen table, and the cold reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. She had lost her job. She had lost her footing on the tightrope, and now she was falling. She sat at the table, the little silver car clutched in her hand, and allowed a single, dry sob to escape her lips. It was the sound of the last gear in a complex machine finally grinding to a halt. Across town, in a penthouse that pierced the clouds, the incident was already being reframed. "You would not believe the audacity," Chloe was saying into her phone, pacing on a white marble floor. "This waitress, this nobody, starts lecturing me. I had to put her in her place." The narrative was already shifting, her act of petty cruelty morphing into a righteous defense of social order. But the story wasn't over. A quiet busboy named Carlos, a young man Maya had often shared her break time sandwiches with, had seen the whole thing. He had seen the sneer, the deliberate flick of the wrist, and the quiet, devastating dignity of Maya's response. He hadn't said a word, but his smartphone had been discreetly recording from the service station. That night, fueled by a sense of injustice, he uploaded the short, shaky video to a minor city gossip blog with a simple, anonymous caption: "Rich girl Chloe Beaumont redecorates waitress at the Ember Hall." The video was a tiny digital ember tossed into the vast, dry wilderness of the internet, and by morning, it was about to be fanned into an inferno, catching the eye of a man who didn't just build empires, but who knew, better than anyone, how quickly they could burn. Charles Beaumont, at 55, was a man carved from granite and ambition. His office on the top floor of the Beaumont Global Tower was a study in controlled power, not of opulent wood and leather, but of stark chrome, black stone, and a single panoramic window that offered a god's-eye view of the city. He had built his empire not with an inheritance, but with a second-hand lathe, a small loan, and a work ethic that bordered on pathological. He still had calluses on his hands. He loved his daughter, but it was a love strained by a deep, gnawing disappointment. He had given Chloe every advantage, every luxury he had been denied, and in doing so, he feared he had created a perfect, beautiful, hollow vessel. He saw his own drive and hunger reflected in her as a shallow, brittle arrogance. She mimicked his ruthlessness, but possessed none of his underlying integrity. He didn't learn about the incident at the Ember Hall from a phone call or a sycophant. He learned about it at 5:30 a.m. when his head of corporate security, a former intelligence officer named Hale, sent him a single encrypted link with the subject line: "Potential brand exposure." Charles tapped the link. He watched the shaky 10-second video. He saw his daughter's sneering face. He saw the arc of red wine. He saw the young waitress stand there, soaked and stunned. And then he heard her quiet, measured response. He listened to her words about the wine, the pin, about value versus price. He watched it a second time, then a third. A cold, heavy feeling settled in his stomach. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse, a profound and sickening sense of failure. This was the legacy he was building, a dynasty of casual public cruelty. But his reaction was not just personal, it was strategic. He was in the final delicate stages of the most important acquisition of his career, a hostile takeover of Donovan Motors, a legendary but struggling American automaker. The company was a dinosaur, but it held patents and a brand legacy he desperately wanted. The deal hinged on winning over the company's founder and majority shareholder, a notoriously reclusive and eccentric industrialist named Silas Sully Donovan. Sully was 75, an old-school titan who had started his career on the factory floor. He was a man who despised the new generation of trust fund executives and valued character, grit, and integrity above all else. He was also, as Charles knew from a meticulously compiled dossier, a fanatical and secretive collector of vintage automobiles. A man who understood the soul of a machine. The gossip blog was still minor, but Charles knew how these things worked. By noon, it would be on major news sites. The name Chloe Beaumont would be linked not with business acumen, but with aristocratic thuggery. And Sully Donovan, a man who read everything, would see it. The deal, his legacy, could be jeopardized by a single glass of spilled wine. He leaned back, the skyline before him a grid of cold, hard light. His daughter was not just a disappointment, she was a liability, a beautifully polished, self-destructing missile aimed at the heart of his empire. The time for indulgence was over. He pressed the intercom on his desk. "Hale, get me everything you have on the waitress in that video. Name, address, work history, family, everything. I want it in 30 minutes. "Already on it, sir. Maya Stone." "And Hale," Charles added, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "find out what Chloe is driving today. Have it remotely disabled. Cancel every credit card and bank account in her name, effective immediately. Then send a car to bring her to my office. She has a new job assignment." 25 minutes later, the file on Maya Stone appeared on his screen. He saw the photo, a serious young woman with intelligent eyes. He saw her address, her spotless work record, and then he saw the notes on her deceased father, Michael Stone. "Renowned independent mechanic and classic car restorer," the file read, "specialized in pre-1970 European sports cars, held in high regard by the collector community." Charles stared at the words. A strange, improbable idea began to form in his mind. It was audacious. It was unorthodox. It was a high-stakes gamble born of pure desperation, but it felt like the only move he had left to play. He looked at another file on his desk, the one containing the deed to a recent personal acquisition. A car he had bought at a private auction, a vehicle so rare it was almost mythical. A car he knew from his research was one of two that Sully Donovan had spent a lifetime trying to acquire. "Hale," he said into the intercom, his voice now calm and decisive, "get me the keys to the Aston, and find a flatbed truck. We're making a delivery." The knock on Maya's apartment door was sharp and authoritative. She opened it, expecting a landlord or a debt collector. Instead, she found a man who seemed to command the very air in the shabby hallway. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, custom-tailored suit, his graying hair cut with military precision. His eyes were the same cold gray as his daughter's, but where hers held petulance, his held the immense, crushing weight of power. "Miss Maya Stone?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it resonated with a bass note of absolute command. "My name is Charles Beaumont. I'm Chloe's father." Maya's blood ran cold. She braced herself for a threat, a lawsuit, a lecture. She instinctively tried to close the door. "I have nothing to say to you." "I'm not here to threaten you," he said, holding up a hand. He didn't try to force his way in. "And I'm not here to apologize. An apology is a word. It's a cheap currency for a debt my daughter can't afford to pay. I'm here to offer you a job." Maya stared at him, bewildered. "A job? I think you have the wrong person." "No," Charles said, his gaze intense. "I believe for the first time in a very long while, I have exactly the right person." He stepped aside, gesturing to the street below. A massive, covered flatbed truck was parked at the curb, its sheer size an alien presence on her working-class street. With a remote, the driver lowered the ramp and the back covering slowly retracted. Resting on the platform, gleaming under the morning sun, was a car that seemed to have been sculpted from moonlight and speed. Its long, elegant lines and silver birch paint were unmistakable. It was a 1959 Aston Martin DBR1. It was not just a car, it was a legend, the winner of Le Mans. One of only 5 ever made, it was a piece of automotive holy scripture. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. She knew this car. She knew its history, its engine specifications, The name of the man who designed its chassis. Her father had a poster of it on the garage wall, a picture he would stare at with a look of reverent awe. What? What is this? She whispered, her anger and suspicion warring with a wave of pure, unadulterated wonder. That, Charles Beaumont said, his eyes fixed on her face, watching her reaction with predatory focus, is your company car. I am in the middle of a business negotiation with a man who does not trust me, does not respect me, and does not speak my language. He speaks in carburetors and camshafts. He speaks in horsepower and heritage. He speaks the language your father taught you. He held out a slim leather folio. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a single vintage key and a crisp new set of registration documents. The owner's name listed was Maya Stone. I'm not giving you a gift, Miss Stone. I'm hiring a translator. I need you to help me speak to Silas Donovan. Your salary will be enough to settle your father's debts and then some. You will answer only to me. Your first day of work is today. He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. My daughter's education also begins today. She's on a flight to Detroit. Her new job is on the assembly line in one of my factories. She will learn the meaning of craftsmanship from the ground up. I build things, Miss Stone, and I will not have my legacy be defined by someone who only knows how to break them. Maya looked from the impossible car on the street to the impossible man standing in her doorway. The world had tilted on its axis. It felt like a dream, or perhaps a trap. But as she looked at the Aston Martin, she saw not a car, but a tribute, a validation of every late night she'd spent with her father in the garage, the smell of grease on her hands, the shared passion that was the only real inheritance he had left her. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to make that inheritance matter. When do we start? She asked, her voice steady for the first time in 24 hours. The first week was a baptism by fire. Maya was installed not in an office, but in a sterile, glass-walled conference room adjacent to Charles Beaumont's own. It was a corporate war room, and she was the new, untested weapon. Charles's executive team, a collection of sharp-suited men with Ivy League degrees and predatory smiles, circled her with cautious curiosity. They saw a waitress in borrowed clothes, a baffling anomaly in their world of spreadsheets and hostile takeovers. They whispered behind her back, their skepticism a palpable force. Maya ignored them. She worked with a desperate, focused intensity, fueled by coffee and the dizzying relief of having paid off every last one of her father's medical bills with the first wire transfer from Beaumont Global. The act felt sacred, a final settling of accounts that freed a part of her soul she hadn't realized was in bondage. Her task was simple in its instruction and monumental in its scope. Understand Silas Donovan. She was given access to the complete multi-million-dollar opposition research file Charles's team had compiled. But where they saw data points and leverage opportunities, Maya saw a man. She read transcripts of old interviews, devoured articles from obscure automotive journals, and studied grainy photographs of a younger Sully in oil-stained overalls, his face alight with pride beside a car he'd just finished building. She saw a man who, like her father, viewed cars not as status symbols, but as living things, intricate combinations of art and engineering, each with its own history, its own soul. The Beaumont executives had prepared a presentation for Sully focused on profit margins, supply chain integration, and market capitalization. Maya knew instantly it would fail. Trying to woo Sully Donovan with a PowerPoint presentation was like trying to describe a symphony by showing someone the budget for the orchestra. This is all wrong, she said to Charles one evening, sliding a thick binder across the polished stone table. They were the only two left in the office, the city a carpet of jewels below them. Charles raised an eyebrow. He had been a silent observer all week, his face an impassive mask. It's the most comprehensive financial play my M&A team has ever produced. You're trying to buy his company, Maya said, her voice gaining confidence. You need to court his legacy. Sully doesn't care about your 5-year growth projections. He cares about the 30-year-old stamping press in his Detroit factory, the one his own father installed. He wants to know you see it not as an outdated asset to be liquidated, but as a piece of history that still makes an honest piece of American steel. She began to speak, not about numbers, but about stories. About the design philosophy of the Donovan Skyliner, the company's most iconic model. She talked about the unique tooling required for its fenders, the racing lineage of its V8 engine, the specific tannery in Ohio that had supplied its leather for 40 years. She spoke with the effortless authority of a native, her father's passion flowing through her. Charles listened, his expression unchanging, but a new light was dawning in his cold gray eyes. The executive saw a waitress. He was beginning to see an arsenal. He had hired a translator, but he was discovering he had acquired a strategist. "He's agreed to a preliminary meeting," Charles said finally, closing the binder, "at his estate, upstate, in 2 days. It's not a negotiation, it's an audition, and you will be leading it." The doubt and fear that had been churning beneath her professional facade rose up. "Me? What about your team?" "My team speaks a language he despises," Charles said flatly. "You speak the only language that matters." He paused. "And one more thing. You won't be arriving in a corporate helicopter. You'll be driving the Aston." The drive upstate was transformative. For the first time, Maya was not a servant or a debtor or a corporate anomaly. She was simply a driver, connected to a machine that was a masterpiece of human ingenuity. The thrum of the engine vibrated through the worn leather of the seat, a powerful, mechanical heartbeat. The wind whipped through her hair. With every perfectly executed do, the thrum of the 6-cylinder engine was a living thing, a low, resonant hum that vibrated up through the worn leather of the driver's seat, through the thin fabric of the borrowed suit, and settled deep in Maya's bones. It was a language she understood better than words. Every subtle change in pitch was a question from the machine. Every responsive pressure on the accelerator, every perfectly timed shift of the gated gearbox was her answer. The Aston Martin DBR1 was not a car, she realized, as the miles of winding upstate road dissolved behind her. It was a covenant between steel and spirit, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was a part of something whole. The fear that had coiled in her stomach all morning, the icy dread of an imposter about to be exposed, had been burned away by the heat of the engine and the clean, sharp scent of high-octane fuel. The ghost of the timid waitress who flinched at raised voices and measured her worth in tips had been left behind in the city haze. Out here, with the sun on her face and her hands sure on the wooden steering wheel, she was not Maya Stone, the debtor, the dismissed. She was Michael Stone's daughter, and that, she was beginning to understand, was a formidable thing to be. Sully Donovan's estate was a declaration of war against opulence. There was no sweeping, tree-lined driveway, no colonnaded mansion. The paved road gave way to a mile of bone-jarring gravel that ended in a stark, gravel-swept clearing. The buildings were severe, functional structures of weathered steel and gray timber, looking more like a high-security industrial compound than a billionaire's retreat. The only concession to beauty was the towering forest of pine and oak that pressed in on all sides, a silent, ancient army standing guard. As she brought the silver birch Aston to a halt, the silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Charles Beaumont, sitting beside her, looked out of place, a creature of boardroom chrome and glass marooned in a world of rust and earth. Before he could move, the heavy steel door of the largest building slid open. The man who emerged was carved from the same granite as the landscape. Silas Sully Donovan was tall, gaunt, his frame all sharp angles under a faded flannel shirt and denim worn thin at the knees. His hands, which hung loose at his sides, were massive, knotted with veins and scarred with the memory of 1,000 engines. But it was his eyes that held you. A pale, piercing blue that seemed to strip away artifice and stare directly at the machinery of your soul. He paid Charles Beaumont no more attention than he would a piece of gravel under his boot. His entire being was focused on the car. He didn't walk towards it. He stalked it. A slow, deliberate circle, his boots crunching on the gravel with a rhythm like a funeral drum. He didn't touch it, not at first. He just looked, his gaze analytical and unforgiving, cataloging every curve, every seam, every reflection in the hand-beaten aluminum. Finally, he reached out a single, gnarled finger and traced the line of the front fender, a touch so light it was almost a caress, yet freighted with a lifetime of history. "5," Sully said. his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. 5 of these were ever built. 1 is in a state of terminal disrepair. 2 are in museums, locked away under glass like Pharaoh's tombs. 1 sits in an air-conditioned palace in the desert, a jewel for a man who wouldn't know a distributor cap from a dinner plate. He stopped his circle and stood directly in front of the car's grille, his shadow falling over its iconic shape. He finally turned those laser blue eyes on Charles. And 1 belonged to my father. It was his heart. It was stolen from his garage in the winter of 1978, a wound that never healed. His gaze hardened into something akin to contempt. So I'll ask you once, Beaumont, where did you dig up this ghost? The air crackled. Charles remained preternaturally calm, the CEO facing down a hostile board member. The vehicle was acquired through a private auction in Geneva, Mr. Donovan. The chain of title is clean, verified by the best experts in the field. I brought it as a symbol of my profound respect for your family's legacy. A sound that was not quite a laugh escaped Sully's throat. It was a harsh, bitter bark of sound. Respect? You parade my family's stolen history in front of me and call it respect? You think my legacy is a commodity you can buy and sell? You're not just a shark, Beaumont. You're a goddamn grave robber. The deal was dying. Maya could feel it. She could see the life draining out of it, pooling on the gravel at their feet. Charles's face was a mask of controlled fury, his gambit having backfired in the most spectacular way possible. This was it. The precipice. The moment the tightrope snapped, and in that moment, something cold and clear settled over her. It was the same clarity she'd felt in the Ember Hall, the quiet fury of truth. Her voice, when it came, was steady. He's right, Maya said. Both men turned to look at her as if she'd just materialized from thin air. Charles's eyes flashed with a warning she ignored. What did you say, girl? Sully's voice was sharp, suspicious. He's right to be angry, Maya clarified, stepping out of the car and closing the door with a solid, definitive click. She walked to the front of the Aston, placing herself between the two titans. If this were your father's car, Mr. Beaumont's gesture would be a grotesque insult. She ran her hand over the same fender Sully had touched, her fingers finding an immediate familiarity with the cool metal. But it isn't. Sully's eyes narrowed into slits. That is a DBR-1. Don't play games with me. It's a perfect recreation, Maya said, her voice gaining strength, infused with an authority that came from 1,000 hours spent in a dusty garage with her father. A work of genius, certainly, perhaps one of the finest tributes ever built, but it is not one of the original 5. Prove it, Sully snarled, taking a step closer, his sheer physical presence an act of intimidation. Maya didn't flinch. She knelt, pointing to the line of flush-mounted rivets along the chassis panel. The original Feltham-built cars used a specific type of Hong Kong-grade rivet, an alloy that was slightly softer. When they were set, the tool would leave a microscopic star pattern on the head. You can only see it if the light hits it perfectly. These, she ran her finger over them, are flawless. A modern, harder alloy. Stronger, yes, but not original. She stood and moved to the side of the car, gesturing to the luminous paint. And the color. It's called silver birch, but the original mixture from the late 50s had a trace of yellow oxide in its base primer. It gave the silver a subtle warmth, almost a champagne glow in direct sunlight. This is a modern glacurate paint. It uses a titanium dioxide primer. The color is colder, purer, more brilliant to the modern eye, but it lacks the soul of the original. Sully was silent, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something, not respect, not yet, but a grudging curiosity, had entered his eyes. Maya delivered the final, irrefutable point. She walked to the front wheel well, her borrowed suit jacket brushing against the tire. But the real proof is something only a true student of these cars would know. At the 1958 Goodwood Tourist Trophy, the car that would become your father's, chassis number 2, was driven by Sterling Moss. On lap 47, he clipped the chicane at Woodcote Corner. It barely scratched the paint, but it put a hairline fracture in the lower front subframe. The Aston mechanics repaired it overnight with a single distinctive TIG weld. It's a tiny detail, a scar hidden deep inside. I've spent the last 2 days studying the schematics and maintenance logs for all 5 chassis. This car's subframe is pristine. Perfect. It has no history, no scars. She finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze without wavering. Whoever built this car loved the DBR1, but he didn't know its story. It's a beautiful body, Mr. Donovan, but it doesn't have the soul you're looking for. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. The wind whispered through the tall pines. Charles Beaumont stood utterly still, a statue of black wool and astonishment. Sully Donovan stared at Maya, his blue eyes no longer just looking at her, but seeing her. The aggression had receded, replaced by a slow, dawning sense of disbelief, as if he were seeing an impossible creature in the wild. He had built an entire life, an entire industry, on the foundation of unvarnished truth and mechanical integrity. And this young woman, this advisor, had just dissected his rage and laid its premise bare with the calm precision of a surgeon. "Stone," he said, the name a quiet rumble. He wasn't asking. He was testing the sound of it. Any relation to a mechanic named Mike Stone? Had a little shop off the interstate? Smelled of gasoline and justice? The mention of her father's name was a physical blow, a rush of grief and pride that tightened her throat. "He was my father," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Sully nodded slowly, a deep, knowing gesture, and for the first time, the granite features of his face softened, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Mike Stone, a goddamn magician. He balanced the crankshaft on my old Pantera so perfectly it idled like a Swiss watch. Never overcharged me, never lied to me. Said a man's character was like an engine's timing. Either it's right or it's wrong. There's no in-between." He looked from Maya to the car and then to the inscrutable face of Charles Beaumont. "Seems character is hereditary." He jerked his head toward the large steel building. "All right, Beaumont, your advisor has bought you a ticket inside, but your money men, your lawyers, they all wait out here with the ghosts." He looked directly at Maya. "You and I, Miss Stone, we are going to talk, not about mergers or acquisitions. We're going to talk about machines." The interior of the building was not a garage. It was a cathedral, a vast, climate-controlled space where automotive legends rested on polished concrete floors under soft, directional lighting. A Ford GT40, still bearing the grime of Le Mans. A Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing, its doors open like a silver angel's wings. A Lamborghini Miura, its sensuous orange curves seeming to pulse with latent power. It was a breathtaking testament to a life spent in pursuit of mechanical perfection. For the next 4 hours, what unfolded was not a negotiation, but a communion. It was a high-stakes test, subtler and more profound than the one outside. Sully would lead her to a car, his hand hovering over its flank, and tell a story. Not of victory, but of failure. "The Duesenberg SJ," he murmured, standing before the magnificent black behemoth, a masterpiece of engineering, but the supercharger was a nightmare. Whined like a banshee and was prone to catastrophic failure if you didn't get the lubrication mixture exactly right. "We lost a race in 35 because of it." The old Maya would have stayed silent. The new Maya, the one forged on the drive up, responded. "That's because they were using a castor-based oil that wasn't viscous enough at high temperatures. My father worked on one. He discovered that a modern synthetic, blended with a zinc additive, eliminates the friction that caused the impeller to warp." She wasn't just reciting facts. She was engaging with his memory, honoring the problem that had plagued his predecessors. He moved to a Tucker 48. "The Cyclops Eye. Brilliant idea. Terrible execution. The linkage was flimsy and would snap on bumpy roads, leaving the driver blind in the corners. A simple Heim joint and a reinforced bracket would have solved it," Maya replied instantly. "It was a manufacturing shortcut, not a design flaw. The soul of the idea was pure, and so it went." A conversation conducted in a language of camshafts and gear ratios, of leather polish and metal fatigue. With every exchange, Maya could feel the layers of Sully's armor peeling away. She wasn't just an expert, she was a kindred spirit. She understood that these were not just assets, they were stories, triumphs, and heartbreaks rendered in steel. Charles Beaumont stood by, a silent, powerful shadow, witnessing a masterclass in a language he was only just beginning to comprehend. He hadn't brought a translator. He had brought a priestess to officiate a sacred rite. Finally, Sully led her to a corner of the vast space, to a shape hidden under a heavy canvas tarp. With a single fluid motion, he pulled it back. Beneath lay not a pristine classic, but the rusted skeletal remains of a 1932 Ford Deuce coupe. Its fenders were gone, its engine a block of fused rust. It was a wreck, a piece of scrap. But Sully placed his hand on the corroded roof with a tenderness he hadn't shown to any of the multi-million-dollar masterpieces. "This was the first," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier aggression. "Built it with my own 2 hands when I was 16. I ground the valves, welded the chassis, and painted it myself with a brush. This is where it all started. Where I started." He turned to her, his blue eyes searching her face. "My company is in trouble, Miss Stone. The world wants electric. It wants soulless appliances on wheels. My board, my shareholders, they all want to buy the future. They tell me to liquidate the past, to scrap the old factories, to forget everything this piece of junk represents." He paused, his gaze sweeping over to include Charles. "He wants to buy my name, my patents, my market share. What do you see when you look at this?" It was the final question, the one that mattered. A Beaumont executive would see a write-off. An accountant would see a liability. Maya looked at the rusted hulk, but she saw the ghost of a 16-year-old boy with grease under his fingernails and a fire in his heart. She saw the dream. "I see the anchor," she said softly. "It's the one thing that keeps the entire ship from being swept away by the storm. Anyone can build an electric motor, Mr. Donovan, but no one else can build a Donovan. Your legacy isn't in your future patents. It's in the integrity of that weld you made when you were 16. It's in the roar of the flathead V8 you first brought to life. You aren't looking for a buyer." She turned for the first time and spoke directly to Charles, her voice ringing with newfound command in the vast silent space. "And you, Mr. Beaumont, are not looking to acquire a company. You are applying for the position of custodian." She looked back at Sully. "You need someone who won't just slap your name on a new product, but who will take the soul of this car and infuse it into everything that comes next. Someone who understands that you don't restore something like this by making it perfect and new. You honor its scars. You preserve its history. That is the only part of Donovan Motors that matters, and it's not for sale. It can only be earned." The deal was closed in that moment. Sully Donovan looked at her and then at Charles, and a slow, wry grin spread across his face. "Beaumont," he declared, "you are a cold-blooded bastard, but your instincts are sound." He pointed a thick, steady finger at Maya. "Draw up the papers for a joint venture, Donovan Beaumont Automotive. But there are conditions. She," he said, his voice unequivocal, "is my voice on the board. She runs the new Heritage and Design Integrity Division. Nothing with the Donovan name on it gets built without her signature. It's not negotiable." The flight back was a descent from the stratosphere. The city sprawled below, a circuit board of cold, indifferent light. The landmark deal was done, but the silence in the jet's cabin was heavy with unspoken thoughts. As they banked over the glittering towers, Charles Beaumont finally spoke, his voice devoid of its usual commanding tone. "My daughter," he began, the words sounding stiff, ill-fitting. "Her actions were a profound failure of her character, and therefore a failure of mine." It wasn't an apology, it was an assessment, a cold analysis of a flawed asset. "She exposed a weakness in my legacy. In doing so, she inadvertently exposed your strength. I don't believe in apologies, Miss Stone. I believe in capitalizing on events. You perform beyond all expectations. You are now an indispensable asset to my empire. See that you continue to be." Maya looked out the window at the infinite grid of other people's lives. She felt no warmth, no gratitude. She felt a chilling clarity. She had not been welcomed into a family or taken under a wing. She had been promoted from a disposable tool to a valuable one. The victory was hers, and hers alone. It was cold comfort, but it was solid ground. Months later, Maya's world was Detroit. Her office was not a pristine glass box, but a sprawling, sun-drenched loft in a revitalized corner of the old Donovan factory, the air thick with the scent of drafting paper, hot coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of the factory floor below. Her desk was a chaotic landscape of blueprints, engine schematics, and clay models. She was not an advisor. She was a builder. One frigid autumn afternoon, a long wooden crate arrived by special courier. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a flawlessly detailed, handcrafted scale model of the 1932 Ford Deuce Coupe, the rusted wreck from Sully's collection, but restored to the gleaming, fire-engine red perfection it must have held in his teenage dreams. The plaque on its base was simple: "For the anchor, keep us true. SD." Tucked beside it was a smaller square envelope of heavy cream stock. The handwriting inside was elegant, practiced, yet held a subtle tremor. It was not a long letter of apology. It was a single sheet of drafting paper. On it was a clean, precise, and surprisingly beautiful sketch of a new side view mirror, its lines clearly inspired by the aerodynamic teardrop shape of the Aston Martin DBR1. It was elegant, modern, yet it paid homage to the past. Beneath the sketch were two words: a beginning. It was signed simply CB Chloe Beaumont. Maya placed the sketch on her desk, beside the model of the Ford, and next to the small worn silver Porsche pin her father had given her so many years ago. One represented the past she was charged with protecting. One represented the future she was now tasked with building. And the pin was the constant, the compass that pointed her home. She had not been rescued. She had not been given a key. She had been thrown into the fire and had emerged with the knowledge that she didn't need a key at all. She had the skill, the integrity, and the courage to build her own goddamn door, and then to design the car that would drive right through it.